American Family News, I'm Bronson Woodruff. Iran has executed a man accused of spying for Israel. Here's Fox's Jonathan Savage.
Pedram Madani is the latest in a long list of people executed in Iran for allegedly being an Israeli spy. He was arrested in 2020. Madani is said to have tried to send classified information to Israel about critical locations in Iran. He was also accused of acquiring wealth by illegal means. 4 weeks ago, Iran hanged another man identified as a high-ranking Israeli spy, Mohsen Langarnishin.
New Orleans officials are continuing to search for 2 escaped jail inmates. Here's Todd Pyro.
This search reportedly costs around $250,000 per week. Hundreds of police officers and deputies working 12-hour shifts in search of those escaped inmates. Derek Groves is convicted of multiple murders and was awaiting sentencing before the jailbreak. Antoine Massey charged with domestic abuse and car theft. 2 other fugitives were recaptured on Monday, nearly 300 miles away in Texas, in an operation that included several law enforcement agencies. Newly released police video showing the suspects leading authorities on this high-speed chase, even going in the wrong direction before being cornered. A 14th person has now been arrested for allegedly assisting the escaped inmates. The latest is the sister of one of the remaining fugitives.
Authorities are offering a $20,000 reward for any information that leads to an arrest. The governing board for California high school sports is changing its competition rules at this weekend's state track and field championships. This is to allow more girls to take part amid controversy over a male competing against girls. The California Interscholastic Federation said in part in a statement that under this pilot entry process, any female student athlete who would have earned the next qualifying mark for one of their section's automatic qualifying entries in the CIF state meet, and also meet some other criteria, has now been given an opportunity to compete in the upcoming 2025 CIF State Track and Field Championships. Professors are going back to the basics in their classrooms by using handwritten exams in class and making students show proof of their work. This is to combat artificial intelligence. Fox reports a survey shows 92% of undergraduate students are using AI today, compared to 66% last year. Stephen Cicerelli is an English professor at St. Peter's University in New Jersey. He went on Fox and shared one tool he uses to detect AI-written papers.
In-class writing works, but I've also been using Google Assignments, and it kind of almost feels like I'm giving away my secrets and students are listening. And you can track the document history, and it'll show you minute by minute how the student put the paper together. You can see if they made edits, you can see if they misplaced a comma, you can see all of that stuff. So when you see that at this minute there was no paper, and then at this minute there was an entire paper, something came in.
So you can check each student using this device.
Yeah.
A Canadian Christian educator and pro-Israel activist says he's thankful that no one was killed at this past weekend's Jewish march in Toronto. AFN's Chad Groening has more.
Attendance at Sunday's event exceeded expectations as 56,000 Canadians took to the streets of downtown Toronto to show solidarity for the nation of Israel. The march took place just a few days after 2 Israeli embassy staff were murdered by an Islamic terrorist sympathizer in Washington, D.C. Dr. Charles McVitie is president of Canada Christian College, who attended the event along with several Christian pastors. He says attendees were threatened by jihadists.
For example, one jihadist was walking around with a hand grenade strapped to his belt, threatening everybody. And we reported this to the sergeant. He called up to the powers that be, and they told him to do nothing. And the police did nothing and let this man threaten everybody all day with his hand grenade. It was something that the Nazis would do. I was threatened. If that hand grenade went off, I would have died.
McVitie says police were really not protecting the Jews.
They were not wanting to upset the jihadis. And that's really policing in a nutshell in Toronto. Do everything to not upset the jihadis. That's why the Israeli government has put out a travel warning for Jews going to Canada.
I'm Chad Groening.
For American Family News, I'm Bronson Woodruff.
The political climate in America has changed. We've been given a reprieve, and we have to work together to take advantage of that momentum and effect even more cultural and spiritual change. We can rebuild America. The American Family Association is working to do just that, and when you join with your support, it helps maximize the impact. As our thanks, we'll give you a DVD of biblical financial advice from Rob West called Biblical Stewardship. Please visit afa.net and get started today.
Welcome to Today's Issues. Join us for the next hour as we offer a Christian response to the issues of the day. Here's your host, Ed Vitagliano.
And welcome to Today's Issues. Ed Vitagliano sitting in for Tim Wildman this week. It is Wednesday, May 28th. Joining me in studio, Fred Jackson. Good morning, Fred.
Hello, Ed.
And Chris Woodward. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, it's the middle of the week, the middle of the last week in May. We're about to head into June. Summer's going to be right around the corner, and we're going to be soon talking about how we're halfway through the year. And, man, things have been just a freight train of events and things going on. And, Chris, you're going to start us off with the first news item of the day.
Yes. Well, there has been a lot of coverage this morning, and understandably so, continuing coverage, I should say, of Jake Tapper and this book that he wrote with a guy named Alex Thompson. Jake Tapper is from CNN. Alex Thompson is a journalist. And they co-wrote a book that they claim reveals people conspired together to cover up Joe Biden's mental state before, during, and even after the presidential campaign from 2020 on through 2024. And it's gotten to the point now where even Jake Tapper is claiming that the Biden scandal, he calls it, was worse than Watergate. I want to begin here and go through several clips here. Let's hear it from Jake Tapper from the beginning. Clip 1.
It is an entirely separate scandal. It is a scandal.
Yes.
It is without question, and maybe even worse than Watergate in some ways.
Right.
Because Richard Nixon was in control of his faculties when he wasn't drinking.
Now, I want to stop here for a moment because Watergate happened long before I was born. You remember Watergate unfolding. You were not working in news, but you saw it happen.
And I was probably in junior high school, and the junior high school, early high school years. But I do remember being in a grocery store, standing in line, and over the intercom they were playing Richard Nixon's resignation.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, it was a stunning turn of events. So I find it interesting. Fred, I'll toss this to you unless you want to.
I was just going to say, if there was indeed a cover-up, and I'm just kind of removing myself to be the news guy here, if there was indeed a cover-up, is it at least at the same level, if not worse than Watergate?
Oh, there was a cover-up. There's no doubt that Richard Nixon tried to cover up the events of the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. Interestingly, he had tapes of every conversation inside the Oval Office, and in part that is what led to Nixon's downfall. I'm not sure, Fred, I'll toss it to you first. I'm not sure this is on the same level as Watergate. I understand Jake Tapper's point that Richard Nixon had control of his faculties, but that was the president of the United States breaking the law and covering up. He did not instigate the break-in, as far as I remember, but he tried to cover that up. That was kind of a stunning revelation of what I'm guessing a lot of presidents did. Okay, he did kind of get caught, but this, I'm not sure that what surrounds President Joe Biden's mental decay is the same thing, because it wasn't Biden necessarily covering up, as the people around him. But it's probably just splitting straws.
Yeah.
This is. I do agree with Jake Tapper. This is a scandal.
It is,
because it was meant to influence an election, and the fact that Jake Tapper, along with others in the mainstream media, played along with this and participated in the cover-up, as well as apparently leadership in the Democratic Party and members of the Biden administration. They were all in on this, so it absolutely is a scandal.
Absolutely. 2 points I want to make. Chris says he wasn't born when Watergate came around, but his long-lost uncle, Bob Woodward, reported on it.
We go joining us now is my Uncle Carl.
No, that's Carl Bernstein.
Yeah, I know, but, anyway, bad joke. Okay.
2 points. It is laughable, at the very least, that Jake Tapper would call this a scandal. If he really believes it's a scandal, Jake Tapper is the worst anchor CNN ever had, because Fox, with some integrity, has been reporting on what Jake Tapper has said over the last year about Joe Biden, about, denying, CNN and others, denying what was visible to 99% of the American public,
right?
That Joe Biden wasn't playing with a full deck. Everybody knew that. So everything that Jake Tapper is saying, now that he has a book out there, which I'm told is selling like hotcakes.
Yeah.
So he's making a whole pile of money.
Right.
So for Jake Tapper now to say, it's just horrible what the Democrats did, and just horrible what the circle around Joe Biden did, I'm sorry. I just can't take Jake Tapper seriously. It's just, these people knew what was going on. They hid it because Jake Tapper and the rest are closet Democrats.
They had their finger on the scale.
Yes.
And they were influencing,
trying
to influence, and probably successfully influencing, maybe even way back as far as the 2020 election, but certainly trying to influence the 2024 election, when their job is to be the watchdog of government, not the paid shills for a particular political party in power.
Yeah.
To go with this, Fox did a segment on this today, spent a lot of time on Jake Tapper's comments that we just played for you guys. And then they brought in a Democrat representative named Ro Khanna. Khanna represents a portion of Silicon Valley out in California, and he says Dems should own up to this situation here. Clip 2.
Well, I do have regrets for backing him for a second term. That was a mistake. I've said that the Democrats should own up to that. We should have pushed back against a lot of what we were hearing from the White House. I met him a few times. In those instances, he was fine, but the reality is he shouldn't have run. And I think the Democrats would be better just owning up and saying that was a mistake. The American people are fair, but we do have to take accountability.
Now, Lawrence B. Jones then pushed back on Representative Khanna, and I have that exchange here. Clip 3.
Yeah, but Congressman, I think it's more than a mistake. A mistake is when I forget to put my right signal or my left signal on. The book outlines that it was intentional, and as long as he was breathing, the aides and members of Congress, the Democrat establishment just wanted to keep him alive so they could get the agenda. So is this a massive cover-up?
Well, certainly not that I know of. I mean, I met him a few times in the year. He was perfectly fine. But I do think what the mistake was that we should have pushed back more against the old guard and insisted on new voices. And now you're seeing that in the Democratic Party. You're seeing a lot of new voices there. You're seeing a demand for the old guard to step aside. And you're seeing a focus on the economy, of a real vision of how we're going to raise wages, get new jobs.
Now, he talked about how he met him a few times and he was fine. From what we gather from the book that Tapper and Alex Thompson wrote, there were people that were literally like, these are the times that you can see Joe. He's at his best today. He's all there. All the lights are on in the White House, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So anybody that says, I met him and he seemed fine, I don't think we can just go with that.
Well, I mean, for someone like that, the congressman, there probably won't be any consequences, because we weren't there when he, quote unquote, met with President Biden on occasion. So it's entirely possible that Joe Biden was more lucid on certain days than on others. But Fred, it seems clear that the way this whole thing unfolded, we've talked about this on the program a lot because it's 2025. We go all the way back to 2020, that when it became apparent that that the radical left, represented by Bernie Sanders, had a real shot at the nomination, that what the Democratic Party establishment did was, metaphorically or literally, get everybody into the same room. And I think Amy Klobuchar was not doing bad, and everyone in and say, look, we need to get Joe Biden the nomination. Got black leaders in because South Carolina was coming up in the primary season in 2020. We have to get Joe elected because we can't have Bernie Sanders, a self-described socialist, run against Donald Trump because Trump will win re-election. And we all know about Trump derangement syndrome, and everybody agreed. And I think the deal that was cut with Bernie Sanders and the radical left is, okay, if we do this and Joe Biden gets in, then we want our agenda being represented by the Biden administration. And as it all turned out, whatever you think of the 2020 election, Biden did win the nomination. He got elected, and the left between 2020 and 2024 came calling for their payoff.
Yeah.
And the only thing that mattered was getting that agenda, continuing the agenda under Biden, and getting him a second term so the agenda could take root in this country. And the people who made deals in 2020 made a deal with the devil in covering up Joe Biden's obvious impairment. Listen, there are people who are questioning whether Jill Biden should have told her own husband, you don't need to run again, but she was all in as well.
Yeah. I have a theory.
Okay.
So we'll go back to 2020. Barack Obama looked at the field. Like you, there was concern. Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, these other people. Let's put Uncle Joe and all kind of surround the wagons around Joe, get him in there. And Barack Obama thought, and then I'll put my people in close contact with Joe Biden once he gets in the White House. Because I don't think it's even speculation anymore. It was Barack Obama's people that ran the White House for Joe Biden. His very close individuals that were part of the Obama administration then became part and were running the show for Biden. That is why you had such a left-wing agenda that manifested itself as soon as Joe Biden got in there. I think that the whole game plan was being run. I think Barack Obama was the coach. He wasn't the president anymore, but he was the coach. Joe Biden happened to wear the captain's sweater.
Yeah.
All right. And he was out there for the public, and he did what he was told. And even when his mental capacity began to deteriorate, they were okay with that because, what did they call it? The electric pen or something like that?
The auto pen.
Auto pen.
The auto pen. We'll just use the auto pen. And that's what went on. Somebody was talking the other day that in order for Biden to have some credibility, the White House created a kind of an Oval Office background.
Yeah, it was a fabricated
Oval
Office.
Yes, and they said they had to make it big so that Joe Biden could read the print on the teleprompter.
Right.
It was a lot of stuff is coming out right now, and then I believe, as part of my theory, is that when Barack Obama in 2024 saw that Joe Biden was a mental disaster, he then, never forget that scene in Los Angeles. Joe Biden's in Los Angeles campaigning. You remember Barack Obama coming up and grabbing him by the arm and leading him off stage.
Mm-hmm.
Within weeks after that, the knives came out. It was the whole June debate, the whole thing, and it was over. So I think Barack Obama ran the show for the 4 years of Joe Biden. I think he was instrumental in getting Biden to step away from things. They thought they had a chance with Kamala Harris, putting her in there. They could play up the female candidate, the black candidate, all of that. They could play that up, but it didn't work because the American people caught on.
Yeah, because there were several missteps on behalf of the Biden campaign, one of which was allowing him to debate.
Yes.
They could have covered Joe Biden, given political cover for Joe Biden refusing to debate Donald Trump. They could have appealed to the fact, look, he's a felon, he's a disgrace. We're not going to dignify this man with a debate. Now, that would have come with some political cost, but it would have been better than the disaster that befell Joe Biden in that debate. By the way, remember, Barack Obama, this was reported by CNN and the New York Times, that when Joe Biden was considering running, Barack Obama said, "You don't have to do this, Joe." Okay, this is before the 2020 race. I think Barack Obama was a shrewd enough political mind that he understood that they had to get some of the younger people in leadership. And we all remember the 17 candidates running in the primaries. I don't think anybody wanted Joe Biden to be president, but it became apparent that they could not outwardly express the direction of the Democratic Party by allowing Bernie Sanders to get the nomination.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. We just played that clip of Ro Khanna talking about, but we have new voices.
Yes, we do.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those new voices are pretty scary.
Yes.
If
They're
you're
all
talking,
radicals.
if you're talking about AOC, you're talking about Crockett, all of those individuals, do they really believe those voices are going to sell well to the American electorate?
Well,
I don't think so.
And the opposite, on the other side of the divide, you have old timers like James Carville saying, no, they don't need to be the new voices. We need to come back towards the middle. So this kind of civil war within the Democratic Party really is just getting untracked.
Oh, yeah. We talked about Rahm Emanuel.
Yes.
The Wall Street Journal article the other day saying the party has to come. The party's image is toxic.
Yes.
I think that was the term he used.
And it's something else in woke. I forget the other. It's another W word, but
yeah. But he says we have to come back to the middle. So the Democratic Party has this great divide right now, which shows no sign of healing whatsoever.
Right. And Chris, to your point, as you played a couple of these clips, the Democratic Party is losing support in minority communities like the Black community, the Hispanic community, because the Republican Party right now looks like it's the party of the economy.
Yes.
And this was always a strength for the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was always seen as the party of law and order, military strength, projecting American influence around the globe. And the Democratic Party was seen as the party of the blue-collar worker. And it is losing that image. And if they continue with an emphasis on these radical policies, that will continue there'll be even more of a decline.
Very
in
true.
Support.
Now, you're not the only one to say that. As a matter of fact, Kellyanne Conway was brought out on Fox this morning for a segment on all kinds of things, including this ongoing effort by the Democrats now to try to attract male voters. Democrats say we're losing males. We're going to do things to be more manly. We're going to appeal to males. We're going to sell the party on to males. And Kellyanne Conway says that's laughable. Clip 6.
Well, they tried this by putting Tim Walz on the ticket. Ainsley, remember, Tim Walz was like the left wing's idea of a really cool Midwestern guy who knows how to fire a gun when she didn't. And he was as big a disaster as was the top of the ticket, Kamala Harris. It's really regrettable that the Democratic Party would have to spend $2, let alone $20 million, to learn about men. They're one half of our society, but look at the numbers. One half of young Latino men voted for Donald Trump, a third of young black men, over 60% of young white men. The swings among men overall, and all kinds of men, blue collar particularly, as Donald Trump has recast the Republican Party as the party of the worker, is undeniable.
I think what Trump has done is extraordinary. Okay, now, part of that, I'm not sure, is a principled position on the part of Donald Trump in terms of, when I say principled, I don't think he was purposefully saying, what can I do to draw young men, which is what the Democrats are doing, trying to figure out how to do that. I think his approach was, I want to get this economy going so that people can work and men can take care of their families. They can have good paying jobs so that young people can buy homes, all that kind of thing. And that, as a businessman in the White House, is what is drawing, I think, probably a lot of these young men. But also the transgender nonsense, I think, doesn't fly with men who are normally protective of women and seeing other dudes, spiking, a volleyball into a girl's face and causing damage. They don't like that. And I think also the border, where not all of them were criminals coming across the border, of course, but a lot of them were gang members and people who had committed crimes in their own countries. And a lot of young men look at that, and that protective nature kicks in at that time too. And they think, you know what, I've got to protect my family or, my parents, whatever. And I do not want that border being unsecured.
I think the Democratic Party thought they could get away with the radical leftist agenda because they had the media on their side.
Right.
But here's what happened. A funny thing happened on the way. The mainstream of America started to understand where the mainstream media in this country was with its bias.
Yes.
And so they got fed up. So they stopped listening to the mainstream media, which supported Joe Biden's, it was an invasion, an orchestrated invasion on our southern border. It was really interesting this morning, and maybe we'll get to a little bit later in the program today, California's response to the latest threat from President Trump with regards to trans athletes, boys playing in girls' sports. I think as AP, NORC did a poll, 70% of Americans do not agree with biological boys playing in girls' teams. Biological boys being allowed to go into change rooms, girls' change rooms. This is just still common sense with common sense Americans.
Right.
But here's the problem for the Democratic. They can't move off of this.
No.
They cannot move off of this.
They can't reverse course.
No, they cannot. And so this is a huge problem. And even though the mainstream media may still be out there and they're protecting the Democratic Party on this front, when you got 70% of Americans not agreeing with the mainstream media or the Democratic Party, the question of the Democratic Party is, what are you going to do? Democratic Party, I think, has made one very tragic error. When companies are sitting down and developing policies, they like to hear a spectrum of views.
Right.
They're going to create a new widget, company. They want to hear a perspective, a whole perspective of views on this. The Democratic Party shut the door on anybody with conservative ideas. No, we don't want to hear from you.
Right.
We know what's best for the country. That kind of arrogant spirit caused them to lose this election. And unless things change, they're going nowhere in the midterms.
Well, and I'll tell you something else. We're coming up on a break, but we can, possibly talk about this later on in the program. It's funny how public perceptions change. They don't always change like you think. Sometimes it takes time. So I'm thinking about the Bud Light fiasco with Dylan Mulvaney. Okay, those kinds of things. And by the way, that was a male who dressed like a female, identifying as a female, becoming the spokesperson for Bud Light. The reaction to that among men, young men, and just men, was so visceral.
Yes.
But it fed into all the other stuff that was hanging around in people's minds, I think, about how unfair it is to have men in women's sports and so on and so forth, that kind of turned the ship. Gradually, yes, but definitively turning the ship where people say this is wrong, and the party that thinks this is important when inflation's going through the roof, that's a stain that's going to be very hard to scrub away for the Democratic Party, especially as you point out, Fred. They can't walk it back.
Nope.
They are all in, and that's why you see states like Maine and others saying, we don't care what the Trump administration says, we're sticking with men and women's sports. All right, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, Jenna Ellis will be joining us. We'll be talking about some legal issues. You don't want to miss that. I hope you join us.
It's my turn.
Here is your host for My Turn, Don Wildman.
Two men who lived on tiny Haruku Island in eastern Indonesia had a disagreement. It seemed as though both of these men were rather stubborn and that each laid claim to a certain sago tree. Well, these two fellows decided to settle the question of ownership once and for all. The interesting part of the story was the method they chose to follow to decide who owned that particular sago tree. Of course, they were rather conservative. They decided to answer the question in the traditional way, by seeing who could stay under the water the longest. Now, it's true that to us, this method seemed totally unrelated to the point in question, ownership of the sago tree. But for these two men, the fact that there was no relationship between the two didn't matter. You see, tradition said that this was the way the question was to be answered, and so they answered it in that manner. Questions have always been answered this way on Haruku, and as far as they were concerned, they would always be answered in this manner. You know, tradition is, in many respects, a wonderful thing, for tradition usually preserves that which is good. We're greatly in debt to our parents and grandparents for some of the traditions they passed on to us. We think as we think, act as we act, partly because our forefathers passed it along to us. But let us move on to add that tradition is often very damaging and demeaning. Slavery lasted nearly 1,900 years beyond the life of the one who came to set men free because of tradition. Tradition which no one questioned. Tradition which, thank God, is broken now. But the results of that tradition still linger. Tradition has said that when two countries came to an impassable point in their differences, they went to war, and the strongest was right. Might made right. Now, this tradition is being questioned by civilized man, and rightly so. Each new generation is exactly that, a new generation. And each new generation should seek to build on the good traditions of the past and correct those traditions which we now see to be harmful to mankind. Now, if this is a truth in the dealings of the world, then it is no less a truth in the work of the church. There are many valid and worthwhile traditions in the church, and likewise there are traditions which need to be broken. Someone has said that the 7 last words of one church were these: "We have always done things this way." Well, we don't like to change, many of us. We prefer things to remain as they are. But there's one thing certain in this world. Today is different from yesterday, and tomorrow will be different from today. And let us remember that the founder of our church broke tradition. In fact, he did so quite often. Let us, therefore, take the good traditions handed down to us and build on them. And let us change those traditions which are no longer valid. If we fail to do this and hang on to tradition for tradition's sake, we could end up just like those two villagers on Haruku. You see, they both drowned. They both followed a tradition that was outdated and stupid, and they both lost. Can we expect anything different when we do the same?
This has been My Turn with Don Wildman, a production of the American Family Association.
You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. Jeremiah 29:13.
American Family Radio. This is today's issues. Email your comments to comments@afr.net. Past broadcasts of today's issues are available for listening and viewing in the archive at afr.net. Now, back to more of today's issues.
And welcome back to today's issues. Ed Vitagliano sitting in for Tim Wildman this week. I'm joined in studio by Fred Jackson and Chris Woodward. Of course, Steve Paisley Jordahl will be joining us after the top of the hour break. But in the meantime, we bring off the bench, as it were, Jenna Ellis, host of Jenna Ellis in the Morning, heard weekdays at 7 a.m. Central Time, and host of the On Demand podcast found at afr.net. Jenna, welcome back to today's issues.
Welcome, and to me, yes, and hi, and I didn't realize I had been benched, so glad to be off the bench. Like,
well,
wow.
you hadn't been benched, but you're not always on this show. The point I was making was kind of bringing you out of. How about the bullpen? Let's say that.
Well, I was on vacation with my family for a while, so I deserve that a little bit. But
Well,
it was a lot of fun. So.
I don't know why everyone always
back.
assumes that it's a wisecrack for me. I don't know why. I just try to mind my own business and encourage everybody, and yet I get this frequently. Maybe even from the people who know me best. By the way, if we have time, I do want to come back around to something you mentioned on your show this morning. I listened to your show. I try to listen to your show on the way into work every morning because it's a great program. And excellent job this morning. We're going to see if we can get a little bit of a comment or two from you about the conversation you had with Michael Ferris, because he is a treasure for the body of Christ. But first, and maybe the only issue we get to, depending. But Fred, what do you got for Jenna?
Yeah, Jenna, National Public Radio, better known as NPR, gets a lot of money. Your money, my money, Ed's money, taxpayers' money to do their programming. One would not describe their programming as fair and balanced. They have changed radically over the years, and they have joined the far left in their worldview and in their journalistic values. And so, no surprise, President Donald Trump doesn't think taxpayers should have to fund that left-wing bias. And so he is threatening to take their money away. And in response to that, National Public Radio and 3 local stations, public radio stations, filed a lawsuit yesterday against the president. Now, those who have been facing divisions that have been facing cuts in their funding have argued the president doesn't have the right to do that because only Congress has the right to take our funds away because Congress agreed to the funds. But I was taken by the argument that NPR is using. They're saying removal of our subsidies from the government is a violation of the First Amendment. And I thought, wait a minute. Yes, you have First Amendment rights, but Jenna, they don't have a right to say the taxpayer must fund my point of view.
Right. Well, so a couple of things on this lawsuit. So Trump did sign a May 1st executive order for those who want to look it up. It's 14290. That's the number of the executive order. And it seeks to eliminate the federal funding for NPR. I agree with you that I think the separation of powers argument is the stronger one. I was actually talking to Steve Paisley-Jordahl about that yesterday for our news program. Also had on another attorney who frequents my program this morning who agreed with that position. So I think there's kind of some consensus that the separation of powers is probably the best argument for NPR to say that if Congress were to change or modify or defund NPR, that would have to come through congressional legislation, not through the executive branch, this executive order. But as far as the First Amendment claim, NPR is claiming a First Amendment retaliation. So not that they have a constitutional right to taxpayer funding. It's not like they have applied for brand new and have been denied taxpayer funding, and they're saying somehow that they have a right to it. What they're arguing, whether or not it prevails, but to clarify their argument, they are saying that because they have been funded, and that is a current status that they're taxpayer funded, the only reason that Trump issued the executive order to take it away is in retaliation for them expressing constitutionally protected speech under the First Amendment. So it's really important to differentiate that. They're not saying that they have a right to it. They're saying that the executive order cutting funding was done in retaliation for disfavored content, and this is kind of a classic form of viewpoint discrimination.
But still, Jenna, to argue that Donald Trump has the wrong motive, he still has a right to say taxpayers of the country don't have don't have an obligation to fund NPR?
Maybe. And that's really an issue for Congress to decide, right? And so if we think about this a different way, what if a conservative radio station was taking taxpayer funding, had congressional funding, and the Biden administration said, you know what, I don't really like that you're speaking against me. You're talking about God, for example. You are against gay marriage. Some of those things. So I'm going to take away your taxpayer funding. We as conservatives would likely say, hey, you can't do that. We're expressing as a radio network, and not us, obviously AFA and AFR, we're not funded by taxpayers, but if there were such an entity, then we would be saying, you can't retaliate and remove our funding simply because you don't like that viewpoint. So the lawsuit hinges on retaliation and viewpoint discrimination, not just whether NPR has free speech rights kind of in the abstract. But I think really what we're doing is, and what we should be contemplating is whether or not in the First Amendment context, the First Amendment doesn't guarantee funding, but it does prohibit retaliation for protected speech. But that's the challenge that NPR is going to have to face. They will have to prove each and every element of First Amendment retaliation, in addition to separation of powers.
Okay, so the history here in the early 70s and I think part of the late 60s, Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Okay, so that created not only National Public Radio, but also PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service for television. So when people, watch Sesame Street or whatever, that was on PBS, funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I remember growing up and seeing, watching Sesame Street. I think I was in high school. I will say this, just as an aside. I did watch Sesame Street in high school because of those two old guys that were up in the balcony. I thought they were hilarious. But I remember when the show would go off, this program, a product of the funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So the history of this, NPR and PBS are supposedly independent broadcasters created by Congress and funded by Congress. So my question is, do you and apparently they were supposed to be independent and unbiased in what they put on because they're supposed to serve the public good. So let me just ask you this question. Do you think that President Trump's his desire to defund NPR, do you think it is retaliation?
That's a great question. And I think President Trump himself has basically expressed that it is, not in specific legal terms, but he's saying that he doesn't like what NPR is saying, so he thinks that their funding should be removed. And that's pretty classic retaliation. It's just whether or not that's prohibited by law, because some things are retaliation. So, for example, what Governor DeSantis did to the Reedy Creek district here in Florida over Disney's view of the quote unquote "Don't Say Gay" bill. We all remember that controversy. And Disney argued unconstitutional First Amendment retaliation. They did not prevail on that case because the legislature took action for Reedy Creek, which was a government-created entity that doesn't get that type of First Amendment protection because it's a government entity. Here, NPR is not a government entity, so they can assert First Amendment claims. And so whether or not Trump's rhetoric and the action actually rises to the level of First Amendment retaliation and taxpayer funding is considered retaliation in that classic sense that it's a harm legally, that remains to be determined. But I think that there is a really good case, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, for the precedent value of this, even though I think NPR is totally biased. I don't think that they should receive taxpayer funding. But is this the right precedent? I think that remains to be seen. And so the key precedent here for people who want to look up this case maybe is the Board of Commissioners versus Umber, UMBEHR. It's a 1996 Supreme Court precedent that held that even government contractors can assert First Amendment claims if the contracts are not renewed in retaliation for protected speech. So I think NPR has a good argument here, but the better argument is the separation of powers. So a court may not even reach the First Amendment issue if they decide that Trump, as the executive, doesn't even have authority for this executive order.
All right, Jen, Fred again. NPR is not a government entity. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Voice of America is?
Voice of America is my understanding, yes.
Now, Trump doesn't like them either. And of course, he's put a new boss in there. But do they have some right to funding that NPR may not?
If they so Voice of America as a government entity, if they, because, and when we're assuming here, and I'm not exactly totally sure of their structure, I'd have to look into this, but they are specifically, my understanding is, an official international broadcaster of the United States government. So because it's part of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, likely it cannot assert the same type of First Amendment challenge that NPR can if Trump were to remove their funding, but they may have the same claim to a separation of powers argument to say that if there is a statutory construction that Congress is the one that is providing them funding, that the executive can't unilaterally take that away just because he doesn't like it. So it depends on how the agency was created. Is there executive oversight in terms of the funding? Is that legislative in nature? All of those questions are legal questions that I haven't looked into. But for Voice of America, they may be dissimilarly situated to NPR for purposes of the First Amendment.
I personally think that the president probably does not have, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just saying, just as a layman, that the president probably does not have the authority to cut funding for NPR. But I understand it. I understand the impulse because the Republicans in Congress, who now control both houses, even though they're slim majorities, they have resisted really reining in NPR, PBS, the National Endowment for the Arts, Planned Parenthood, all of these that get government funding. The Republicans, even when they're in power, just don't seem to want to touch these kinds of things. I think this is Congress's job to rein in or to cut off spending. And I certainly understand President Trump being frustrated with the Republican Party's inability or unwillingness to do it. I'll give you the last word before we let you go.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And conservatives need to be concerned about the precedential value of these types of executive actions overriding legislation and congressional intent, even if we like the preferred outcome here, because, let's be honest, conservatives aren't really fans of NPR by and large. That doesn't mean then that we would champion something that goes outside the scope of executive authority just because it's Trump doing it. So I agree with you on that, and I do think that NPR likely will prevail unless Congress actually gets it together, and they could just very easily, like my guest said this morning, they could have just put $1 in the funding in this big, beautiful bill for NPR, and that would have solved the problem, and you don't even need to get the judiciary involved. So why is Congress making Trump do all the work? That should be the question.
Yeah. All right. Our guest has been Jenna Ellis, host of Jenna Ellis in the Morning, heard weekdays at 7 a.m. Central Time, and host of the on-demand podcast found at afr.net. Folks, I do want to encourage you to listen to Jenna's program from this morning because it touches on some of these issues, especially her interview with Michael Ferris, who I think is for National Religious Broadcasters, Jenna, is general counsel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And AFA was part of that lawsuit that he discusses, and it's a great win for us as well.
He also discusses in there, and maybe we'll talk to you about this on another occasion, Jenna. He personally did a review. Well, look, I'm just going to, how much time you got?
I have a few more minutes, absolutely.
Okay.
No worries.
All right. So one of the things Michael Ferris discussed with you is the approach of the Democrats to everything President Trump is doing by judge shopping and then filing lawsuits. And we did cut some of this out, and I'll just get a quick comment from you, and then we'll let you go. But Chris, go ahead and introduce the clip.
Yes. This is attorney Mike Ferris saying Democrats are purposely suing President Trump in certain courts to get the rulings they want. Clip 10.
There were 287 cases that have been filed against the Trump administration. 89% of those have been filed in federal circuits where the majority of the judges were appointed by Democrat presidents. And within the districts, within the circuits, 95% of the cases have been filed in districts where a majority of the judges were appointed by Democratic presidents. That's not following the rule of law. It's showing that this is political litigation.
Okay, so Jenna, your comments on this, because this does go to the NPR thing with President Trump. He may wind up losing that. I don't know. But a lot of the things he's doing, I think, are within his purview as the chief executive. And yet the Democratic Party and the left is waging political lawfare, and they are picking courts that will most likely side with them, knowing that since the Supreme Court can only take 100 cases a year, you file almost 300, you're going to get wins. I mean, this is what they're doing, right?
Yeah. And this whole interview is really worth listening to, and I'm glad that you raised this clip because 287 cases, as Mike Ferris talked about, the Supreme Court only takes around 100 a year. And so this means that if the Democrats are forum shopping, they're going to these leftist judges, and they know that it's also in appellate circuits that will likely prevail and the Supreme Court doesn't overturn it, then they're going to have precedent that stays in place just because of the high volume of cases. And so this is classic lawfare. It's trying to rule by judicial fiat. It is not original intent at all of the rule of law. This is rule by the judicial oligarchy. And Mike Ferris's point was that the left not only has a lot more strategy to try to just rule by sheer volume, but they have a lot more funding. And the ACLU and all of these private law firms that are doing this pro bono to initiate this type of high volume of cases just within the first couple of months of the Trump administration, conservatives have nothing comparatively, and we need to remedy that so that we aren't just always on the defensive trying to stop bad litigation, but we can actually do the same thing except for advancing the rule of law and cementing good precedent in these circuits and in these forums where we really need to have better precedent even if the Supreme Court doesn't ultimately touch it.
What's your on-demand podcast this coming end of this week? Will you get something planned or in process?
It's going to be very exciting. I have my good friend Dinesh D'Souza on, and he actually had a great podcast yesterday on his show talking about Elon Musk kind of stepping away from the administration and saying, hey, I tried to get involved in politics and Congress isn't doing anything about Doge. They're not cutting spending, a lot of the things that we've touched on. And so if Elon can't even do this, then where are we at as a conservative party? Why aren't the Republicans doing this? So I sit down with Dinesh for about 25 minutes and we hash this out. And I think his perspectives, and we've gone kind of back to, Barry Goldwater and Reagan and the conscience of a conservative that was, back in the 1960s all the way forward to talking about where we're headed and why Republicans simply can't get this done.
Sounds like a great show. All right, Jenna, thank you so much for being on with us, for staying a few minutes extra. We appreciate it.
Well, I hope that I'm not benched after this.
You're not benched.
So, thanks. Thanks.
You are not benched. All right, thanks, Jenna.
Appreciate it, guys. All right, bye.
Bye. Very interesting, what she's going to be talking about with Dinesh D'Souza. A lot of frustration out there. Elon Musk, Elon Musk is a genius. Has the creative power to create completely different companies. He's not the kind of guy who wastes his time trying to get things done when it's clear nothing will get done. A lot of frustration. I think there's a lot of frustration amongst conservatives with Republican leadership and with the Republican Party because we have this shot to rein in the federal government, and boy, they just seem to be dragging their feet.
Well, we saw it in the first Trump administration when Republicans had control of the House. Remember what happened when he went asking for money for the border?
Yeah.
He ran into trouble with his own party.
Yep.
And now that the big beautiful bill is headed for the Senate. Senator Scott of Florida publicly saying yesterday, I'm not going to support it. We have Josh Hawley saying we're not going to support it. And, Scott saying, well, the Republicans will work with it. Maybe we'll tinker with it, but if we make anything major, we have to send it back to the House.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's from a out here in the boonies, away from Washington, we look at this sort of thing and we say, you guys, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You have control, and you've turned the guns inward on yourselves. You did it before, and you're doing it again. That's one thing the Democrats do well.
Yes.
When they get in power,
they coalesce.
The party that is for the Second Amendment is the best party at shooting itself in the foot every time.
Yeah.
Every time they get in there, they find a way.
Yeah. And for Elon Musk, you mentioned, Elon Musk is used to running a company. He's the big guy. And the order goes out and the orders are carried out. The problem is Elon Musk ran into the realization of what Trump and others call the swamp.
Yeah.
The swamp is big and it's deep. It's just gotten worse and worse in its toxicity, its financial toxicity over the decades. And to try to move that within months, to change things in there, because you see the way these employees, you may have a department that has 15,000 employees.
Right.
5,000 of them don't do anything.
Right.
They remember initially in Doge, they talked about all the people that were working from home, and we found out some of those people working from home had other jobs.
Yeah.
That they were going to.
Yeah, and these buildings were just about empty.
Just about empty. And we all found out about this, and we're scratching our head. How is this allowed to happen? But look where we are right now. We're several months into this, and I'm not sure much has changed.
Well, there's an old quote from, I want to say it's G.K. Chesterton in the early 1900s. And he said, he wasn't just saying Democrats and Republicans. He said, the job of progressives is to make mistakes, and the job of conservatives is to make sure those mistakes don't get corrected. And I always thought that is a brilliant analysis of the inability of the Republican Party and conservatives to make important changes because their primary instinct is to preserve the status quo. Yeah. But what if the status quo has been created by a bunch of far leftists? You've got to change things back, and they seem unwilling.
Jenna made the comment, if Congress would get its act together. I have been in news, not as long as you guys, but I have been in news for almost 25 years. If I had a nickel for every time I've heard or quoted somebody say, if Congress would get its act together, Jeff Bezos would be paying me to go to space. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say, it's true, Congress should get its act together. She was 100% accurate. I totally agree with her. But unfortunately, we're going to be talking about, if the Lord tarries, we're going to be talking to somebody 5, 10, 15 years from now who's going to say, well, if Congress would get its act together, I guarantee you.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, which I think is a great one, Fred, about the swamp in D.C., not all the creatures of the swamp are Democrats.
That's right.
There's a lot of Republican creatures of the swamp. And listen, I think there is growing discontent out there. People who are tired of people going to Washington, supposedly to serve the rest of us, and they come out as multimillionaires.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating. It's beyond our ability to comprehend how you think you're a public servant. If you're making a bundle while you're up there, and then when you leave, you make even more.
Yeah.
I don't know where that frustration is heading. Maybe to members of Congress getting primaried coming up. Who knows? But it is a very frustrating situation, and I'm guessing that's what drove Elon Musk out.
Yep.
Just tired of it. All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break for news. And when we come back, more of today's issues. Hope you join us.
The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast may not necessarily reflect those of the American Family Association or American Family Radio.
Faith, family, freedom. American Family Radio.
Hey, if you're looking for family-friendly entertainment or resources to strengthen your walk with God, there's one name you should remember: American Family Studios. We don't just want to bring you shows, movies, and specials that will entertain or build up your family. We're committed to honoring God by making them both biblically sound and of the highest quality possible. Check us out at AmericanFamilyStudios.net.
This is American Family Radio, a listener-supported ministry of the American Family Association.
For American Family News, I'm Bronson Woodruff. Elon Musk is criticizing a Republican bill containing much of President Trump's agenda. Fox's Ryan Schmelz reports.
The former face of the Department of Government Efficiency says he's disappointed by the cost of the One Big Beautiful Bill. Elon Musk telling CBS News the spending levels and estimated increases to the budget deficit, quote, undermines the work that the DOGE team is doing. The bill contains much of President Trump's legislative agenda on energy, border, and national security, but despite $1.5 trillion in spending cuts, the nearly $4 trillion in tax cuts, and over $200 billion in spending for border and national security, has raised concerns about its impact on the deficit.
President Trump is sending a new warning to Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying he is playing with fire. This is after repeated attacks on Ukraine with no peace deal in sight. Here's Jackie Heinrich.
One of Putin's top lackeys, Dmitry Medvedev, who served as a bridge between Putin's presidential terms, is really ratcheting up the rhetoric with an implicit threat as President Trump weighs these harsh sanctions that he's been considering. Medvedev posted this, quote, regarding Trump's words about Putin playing with fire and really bad things happening to Russia, I only know of one really bad thing, World War III. I hope Trump understands this. It followed Trump expressing frustration that Putin is continuing to stall peace talks while bombarding Ukraine, saying what Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia.
The State Department announced Tuesday they have halted the scheduling of interviews of new visas for foreign students. One department official says the suspension is only temporary and will not apply to those who have already scheduled interviews. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce said on Fox, this is meant to ensure they know who is coming into the country.
We will use and have been using every tool in our tool chest to make sure that we know who it is that wants to come into this country and if they should be allowed to come in. Every sovereign nation has a right to make sure that they know who's in their nation and if they are safe to be here.
The administration is already facing a lawsuit over an effort to bar Harvard University from enrolling international students, with a federal judge temporarily blocking the measure. The State Department has reissued its Level 2 travel warning for Italy over terrorism concerns. This has been in place since 2022, but was just reissued this week. Travel expert Colleen Kelly joined Fox and discussed the updated warning.
I'm not saying not to travel there. Obviously, the State Department has moved up it to a level 2. That means that you should avoid public places. If you're going to go to a smaller town, that's fine. Just be aware.
A 30-day weather forecast. AFN's Robert Thornton says researchers are looking into it.
University of Washington scientists have experimented with Google's GraphCast AI-based weather model. According to phys.org, the researchers compared model forecasts with the most recent state of the atmosphere taken from data used to train the model. Then, errors made in short-term forecasts were used to adjust the initial conditions and then apply them to the reanalysis data used to coach the model. They found their 10-day forecasting ability increased by 86%. They also said their 33-day forecast was reasonably accurate. Climatologist Dr. David Legates of the Cornwall Alliance explains how current non-AI weather models work.
We have models that take all of the physics that we know, equations of motion, that kind of thing, and we put them together and we sort of run it as if the atmosphere were moving forward in time.
He said the concept of this AI model is different than traditional forecast models.
If I see today a weather map that looks like this, what do I think the weather map's going to look like tomorrow? And so what it does is it goes back through the records that we have and says, how many times did the weather map look like this, and what happened the next day?
He said the concept the AI model is using isn't new, as some in the weather enterprise, like Joe Bastardi of WeatherBell, have used the analog approach of looking back at past weather patterns of certain years to make predictions. Legates believes there is room for both traditional models and AI models in the future to support weather forecasting. I'm Robert Thornton.
For American Family News, I'm Bronson Woodruff.
If we lose this cultural war, we're going to have a hedonistic, humanistic society.
Discover the story of the culture warrior Don Wildman and how he went head-to-head with Hollywood, Playboy, the homosexual agenda, and the Disney empire. The movement Don started paved the way for Christians to boldly stand for truth and righteousness in a hostile culture. Watch Culture Warrior today for free. Visit culturewarrior.movie.
Today's Issues continues on AFR with your host, Ed Vitagliano.
And welcome back to Today's Issues. Ed Vitagliano sitting in for Tim Wildman this week, joined in studio by Fred Jackson, and now Steve Paisley-Jordahl joins us.
Good morning, everybody.
I forgot to introduce you as Steve Paisley-Jordahl yesterday.
Yeah, I noticed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of broke tradition. There's probably a 368-day streak or something where you were introduced.
Well, being that I'm not on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, this streak was probably not.
Well, I'm just saying in terms of those 4 days,
Yeah,
I can't ever remember Tim not saying Steve Paisley-Jordahl.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm happy to be either. Just call me. Don't call me anything but late for dinner, is what they say.
I understand that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we had a great first hour, Steve. Try not to mess it up. What's your first story today?
Let's talk about the FBI saying it's going to investigate some issues going on in Seattle. So, on Sunday, there was a rally at the Seattle in Seattle's the City Hall, and it was a Save Our Kids rally. And basically, it was a rally to stand up for girls' spaces. In other words, no boys and girls sports locker rooms. They want the transgender madness has to stop. And by and large, these were Christians. And in fact, at the Antifa decided to show up and hassle them and start fights and get arrested and hassle the cops as well. And it happened that they attacked the rally while they were singing some. So that whole thing went down. And the mayor of Seattle, though, decided it was a good idea to weigh in, and he said that he didn't actually endorse the violence from Antifa, but said that the Christians were pretty much to blame because they're not inclusive. His statement goes, Seattle is proud of our reputation as a welcoming, inclusive city for LGBTQ communities. We stand with our trans neighbors when they face bigotry and injustice. Today's far-right rally was held there for this very reason, to provoke reaction by promoting our beliefs. So anyway, and he's wanting to look into who in the world gave them a permit to put a rally there. You can't do that in Seattle. You can, but he's saying you can't. Well, on Tuesday, a band of Christians got together, and they had a second little protest. This one they called Rattle in Seattle. And again, Antifa showed up, and again, arrests were made. But this time, the FBI, Assistant FBI Director Dan Bongino, put out a statement that says, you know what? We're going to need to look into this religious discrimination, saying that Christians can't protest. The mayor coming in on the side of, he says he's requested an investigation into allegations of targeted violence against religious groups. So the FBI is getting involved. Seattle's now like ground zero for religious freedom for this week.
All right, well, Fred, this is not a surprise when it comes to Seattle or these deep blue states. They are hostile to Christianity. They have a big problem, and that problem is the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Their problem is with the Constitution. And what apparently, from my understanding, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, what Dan Bongino is saying is that the Antifa groups, or sometimes they're not known as a single group, but right. Antifa groups, they are targeting religion, and that's so it's not just the Seattle mayor's reaction that is interested Dan Bongino. It is the fact that these Antifa groups are targeting Christians whenever they gather. Is that right?
His statement says, "We have asked our team to fully investigate allegations of targeted violence against religious groups at the Seattle concert. Freedom of religion is not a suggestion." Now, I have a feeling he's going to take issue also with the mayor quasi-endorsing this violence. He said there were, the counter-protesters, we don't really like the violence, but we kind of understand it, is what his tone of what he said, is his exact words. But,
because the mayor, Bruce Harrell, he's a Democrat, obviously, in Seattle.
Yes.
Okay. He has no problem with Antifa showing up and as counter-protesters. He has blamed not only the Christian group, but also he says was that anarchists infiltrated Antifa to cause the problems. Am I get that right?
I think he understands Antifa as the anarchists. There were counter-protesters. So there's counter-protesters in the mayor's mind. There's counter-protesters, Antifa anarchists.
Antifa is the
and yes.
Okay.
And they infiltrated the counter-protesters.
Okay.
All
right.
Seattle's very, very familiar with Antifa.
Yes.
They're the ones that took over and set up that no-go zone for police in the Summer of Love in 2020.
Wow. That's a misnomer.
Mm.
Well, Fred, this seems to be the problem for these deep blue states is they just don't like God. Tim says they're God haters, and that seems to be accurate, even from a biblical sense, when the Bible says that before we became Christians, we were enemies of God, okay? But they also, these deep blue states, they just are hostile to Christians who practice their faith once it enters into the public sphere. And if you're going to say something that contradicts our pro-LGBTQ ideology, then you become persona non grata.
Yeah, the use by the mayor of the word inclusive. We are an inclusive city. No, you're not.
Apparently not.
That is not true. That is simply not true. And we have seen that over and over and over again. Portland, Oregon, really bad as well. And so you have several of these, and they're all just fact. They're run by Democrats.
Right.
That is the common factor in all of this. And when they talk about tolerance, it's usually tolerance for one side of the equation and not for the other. So I'm glad Dan Bongino, on behalf of the FBI, is going to investigate this. I'm not sure what the result will be because, as we just talked about with Jenna, if the Civil Rights Division of the FBI or the Justice Department goes after somebody and charges are laid, these cities will just go shop for a judge and say, no, this is ridiculous. That's the way it works out there. But again, it goes back to the people who elect people like the mayor of Seattle. This is what Seattle wants.
It is what they want.
Yeah. And then so we need to talk to the companies that are based there. You agree with this?
Boeing.
Because these
Microsoft.
politicians have to get their money somewhere. And so let's talk to these companies that are you supporting these politicians? We don't want to buy your product if you're going to be and let's face it too, there's one other fact too. We don't hear other religious groups being persecuted like this in our cities. Let's just be honest. It's Christians. It is Bible-based Christians who want to stand on biblical values.
Muslims would not want men and women's spaces either. They're even more restrictive.
Yes,
than
and we've
Christians
seen some of that.
Yeah. By the way, excuse me, I am canceling my order for a Boeing 747.
Oh, that's
Boeing
good.
is, in Seattle. And
Glad to hear that.
I want to start the boycott right now.
Yes.
Well, listen. We saw this yesterday when we covered the fact that the Supreme Court did not take up the Massachusetts case on the kid wearing the T-shirt. There's only two genders.
Yes.
And so to your point, Fred, these blue states and blue cities like Seattle, they say they're inclusive, but only if you agree with us.
Yes.
And that is the whole point of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with the government or not, you get your say, and the government needs to protect it, not side with those hostile to it.
Yeah.
Breaking news, by the way, before we get to the next story, the Babylon Bee is reporting that they are joining NPR in suing the government for not giving them millions of dollars. So,
listen, I learned something in the conversation we had with Jenna. I don't know how much you were able to listen to it, Steve. I know you're working during that first hour, but I always had kind of thought that NPR and PBS were government groups, but they're not. They're part of a separate nonprofit under the auspices of the corporation.
But they are joined at the hip.
Yes, absolutely.
And by the way, something, I don't know if you guys got into this. We'll throw this out and we can move on. But a lot of people say they have outlived their usefulness when they were set up in the 50s, 60s.
Well, it was the original act.
70 something.
Well,
70s.
I'm answering the question. The original act,
64.
All right, 67, and then it was finalized, I think, in 71 through some act.
At the time.
I'm done. Yeah.
At the time, though, it was meant to help rural people who didn't have a whole lot of access to television, and there was the big three newscasts were all there were.
Right.
But now everybody's hooked up. You got Starlink if you want.
Yeah.
Everybody's got 18 million different sources of news. So what's the point of the federal government giving these people money?
It's a great question for Congress.
Yes, it is.
Should they take it up, but they don't seem willing? No. All right, what's next?
All right. Do you remember it wasn't that long ago when the CEO of United Healthcare was gunned down in the street? Cowardly assassination guy, a young kid, shot him in the back and killed him. And subsequently, there was a huge divide in this country about was it a good thing to do? Obviously, morally and from the Christian perspective, no, it wasn't. But a lot of people don't really follow that kind of moral code, and they were saying, well, good, because United Healthcare is a dirty old insurance company, and it always denies claims, and it doesn't serve the people right. So, United Healthcare kind of got a message from that. Well, we'd better tighten the ship a little bit. Maybe we're denying too many claims.
So this is after the assassination of Brian Thompson, the CEO.
After the assassination of Brian Thompson, the outcry caused United Healthcare to approve more treatments, cover more procedures and such. Well, guess what that did? That dropped their bottom line. They're not making as much money because they're not allegedly shortchanging the consumer. Well, BlackRock, which is an octopus that has tentacles everywhere, it's I don't even know how to describe it. It's involved in all kinds
kind of
stuff.
conglomerate.
A conglomerate of financial interests and security interests and such. Anyway, they are suing because the improved health care is lowering the bottom line, and they are representing investors.
Yeah, I just looked it up. It's an American multinational investment company. Okay,
Yeah,
so
there you go.
they invested 20% in United Healthcare, apparently. Right?
Yes, they own a large portion of United Healthcare. Now, before you get too feeling too bad for United Healthcare, this is only the latest lawsuit. They are being sued by their employees in federal court, claiming that they were not giving out the 401k money that was due their employees when they retired because they needed the money to bolster the bottom line. They're also being sued in California by CalPERS, saying that United Healthcare illegally upcoded Medicare Advantage treatments, making patients seem sicker than they are. So in order to get more Medicare money. So they're kind of between a rock and a hard place, and they may have put themselves there. I do not want anybody to misconstrue what I'm saying, that it was right to kill the CEO. Wrong,
Right.
bad.
Right.
But the company is being kind of caught right now. I think it had some allegedly sour dealings, and it's coming to pay.
Well,
Piper.
Fred, there's an old expression that everyone hates lawyers until you need one.
Yeah.
Okay. The same thing's probably true about insurance companies. They exist to try to spread out the potential liability of people, whether it's medical care or something happening to your home or your car. But they are primarily in existence to make money.
Yes.
I mean, that's listen, I remember, this has nothing to do with insurance companies, but I remember one of my first jobs writing for a newspaper was applying for a weekly newspaper in Central Mississippi, and I was being interviewed by the owner of a bunch of newspapers and the editor. And they said, "What is the job of a newspaper?" And I naively said, "It's to report the news and blah, 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 blah." And they said, "Nope, it's to make money."
Yeah.
Okay. And that's why insurance companies exist. So from BlackRock's perspective, they're saying you are making us less money because you're paying more claims. But the poor people who have paid into insurance companies, whether themselves or through their employers, they have to have money.
Yep.
You have to provide for the consumer. So I'm not sure how to fix this system, but this just seems wrong.
United Healthcare was just the latest controversy for insurance companies. We've seen in places like California and Florida, where because of fires in California, hurricanes in Florida, you have companies now backing away from insuring houses, or they make the cost just so astronomical that people can't afford. I talked to a guy, I think it was just over a year ago, who had a condo down in Florida, and he was only insuring about a third of it.
Yeah. That's all he could afford.
That's all he could afford. Now, of course, if you go to buy a dwelling, what is the bank going to say? You want to borrow money?
You got to have insurance.
You got to have insurance.
Yeah.
So people are finding themselves between the proverbial rock and a hard place. So they're having to turn to rent a property versus owning, because, as you say, companies are, and I don't begrudge that. Why would you want to start a company and say, I'm really not interested in making money?
Right.
I understand that. But the cost of replacing a house, especially in California, Florida, housing costs have just gone through the roof.
It's nuts.
Most of us could not afford that kind of housing.
Even small houses.
Even small houses. So it's becoming, I think I've mentioned on the air back a couple of years ago now, insurance company was flying a drone over neighborhoods, and they were looking at roofs, and they were saying to homeowners, you got to replace that roof.
Yeah, and there's a tree over here, you got to cut it down.
And your tree over here, you got to cut it down.
Which is also expensive.
Yes, and if you don't do that, we're not going to insure you anymore. So if you've invested, for 30 years in a mortgage and you now own your house, it's a couple of $100,000, you got to have insurance.
Right.
Or, there's an accident, there's a fire, you're left with nothing.
Right.
Absolutely nothing. So the insurance business right now, and usually most states, I think, have a body, because insurance companies have to apply to raise rents. These state entities are going to have to do something about this.
Yeah.
Because you have to have insurance.
Right.
That's all there is to it.
Everything is related. We like simple answers. Oh, well, just, don't do this. Lower your, everything is connected. Why are housing prices so inflated right now? It's another bubble, perhaps, and the banks were related to that back in 2008. It was a banking bubble that created that. And the reason that insurance is so expensive is because houses are so expensive. With healthcare, oh my goodness, the amount of money that flies over your head every time you get a procedure that you never see.
Right.
Thousands of that. If you look at your insurance bill, you might. Thousands and thousands of dollars are being paid one way or the other, even though my out-of-pocket might be $150. It's like the security safety nets in Congress. It's a third rail. No one can touch this stuff. There's so much money flying around, so much power, so much is interconnected. It's like a house of cards.
Yeah, and I was just talking to a lady just this past weekend, and I don't remember what the medication was for, but she said her medication costs $3,000 a month. So she was having to search for something else that wasn't quite as expensive. And like you said, it's a web of interconnected factors that almost make it impossible to solve the problem.
Yeah.
But you know what? That's what Congress exists for.
Yeah.
They should be solving or trying to help solve these problems.
And by the
they're
way,
not.
a president that likes deregulation will help as well.
Yes. All right. Next story.
All right, and we're gonna make Fred answer for this, but Donald Trump still thinks he can make Canada the 51st state. So you remember last week, Donald Trump introduced Golden Dome, which is this missile shield that's supposed to protect all of America from incoming missiles. It's a glorified version of Israel's Iron Dome, which is fairly effective. And so he's saying that we got Golden Dome, and he said, by the way, I told Canada, which this is what he tweeted out on Truth Social. I guess you truthed out or whatever you do. I told Canada, which is very much wants to be part of our fabulous Golden Dome system, it'll cost them $61 billion if they remain separate but unequal. But will cost $0 if they become our cherished 51st state. They're considering the offer, he says.
I don't guess they're considering the offer, Fred.
No, I don't think so. We just had an election in Canada, and it was all about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And his threats about 51st state, and it allowed a very unpopular Capital L Liberal Party to win an election. They were down 30, 40 points.
Yeah, they shouldn't have won it.
They should not have won it, but they got rid of Justin Trudeau, put the new guy in there. He really didn't have to do anything. He just said, look, I'm going to protect you from America.
Yeah.
And they win the election. And the province of Alberta, I think is the only province up there, and they're not the governor, the premier of Alberta is actually talking about separation from the rest of the country.
Yeah, they're getting signatures.
Yeah, Alberta is Canada's Texas.
Yeah.
Very rich in oil, and they figure they can go it alone.
Yeah.
And so they're in serious discussions about the idea.
Can you do that in Canada?
They're looking at constitutionally. They're looking at, can we actually separate, which would be incredible, because if you know your geography with regards to Canada, Alberta separates the rest of the country from British Columbia and the coast.
Yeah, they have no water access.
This would create something, and I know the premier of Alberta has already been down to Mar-a-Lago talking with Trump down there. So that's going to be interesting to see.
The claim is that they have more oil than Saudi Arabia, that they would be the world's...
Alberta?
Alberta has the world's premier oil and natural gas.
And so Trump, I would guess Trump would promise, I have no idea whether this would happen, but Trump would promise, you'll be able to drill, baby, drill.
Oh, yes.
If you come our way.
Yes.
Now, I am curious, well, I guess we'll see how that works out constitutionally in Canada. In our country, maybe with the exception of Texas, all the other states, you're not allowed to leave the Union.
No.
You can't just...
Canada's had this discussion, though, with Quebec and the French-speaking part. So there's precedent, at least they're further down the road in how this might happen, right?
Well, Quebec won some major concessions. They did. They created their own federal party, Parti Québécois. They have at least 50 to 60 members of parliament there, so they have a lot of control. And it helped to have a bilingual French Prime Minister Trudeau. I'm talking about Justin Trudeau's daddy,
right?
Pierre Elliott, for a long time. So Quebec doesn't want to go anywhere. They're quite happy with what they have.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Today's Issues. And folks, we encourage you to continue listening to American Family Radio because there's great programming directly ahead. If you want to listen to the podcast of this show or other shows that you might have missed, you can go to afr.net. There's a little menu. It says podcasts, and you will see all the shows that air on American Family Radio, at least that have podcasts. You can select those and listen at your leisure. Well, we will see you for today. You've been listening to Today's Issues on American Family Radio. And Lord willing, we will see you right back here tomorrow.